Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about the news. Governor Cuomo of New York came out and said that he feels his state is back to where they started. Eric Rosengren said he believes there's a limit to what the Fed can do if we cannot resolve this public health issue. Eric Rosengren is the president of the Boston Fed. By the look on his face, I don't think he really believes that either. And then lastly, studies come out showing that the pandemic could cost the global economy $82 trillion. So anyone who says that there's no cost to staying locked down, show them this article. As always, there will be some jelly at the end, which is something I enjoyed outside of the markets. If you're interested in buying the Koenigsegg Jesko, go ahead and like and subscribe. The Jesko hasn't been released yet, but they're expected to make 125 of them. They will be listed for $3 million a piece. They will have approximately 1,600 horsepower, and they will be able to go 330 miles per hour. Keep your dreams at the front of your mind. Like and subscribe. Welcome to the Portfolio Bulletin. Let's get started. All right, first up, we got Governor Cuomo saying that they are back to where they were before the lockdowns. It says here, coronavirus deaths topped 105 on Monday, which is the same number of lives that were lost on March 26th. Close to 800 people per day were dying from March to early April. So essentially, he's saying the curve has flattened. It continues that the total number of hospitalizations have reduced, and so have the number of intubations. That's a pretty good shot of good old Governor Cuomo acting like he's thinking about stuff. Here's the chart for number of lives lost. You can see here it tops out in April and has been declining steadily. And here we are at May 18th at very similar levels to where we were in March. Just to reiterate and compare, here's the chart for total hospitalizations, and you'll see the same trend. In fact, it looks like it drops off even a little quicker than the previous chart. He goes on to say that the number of deaths has decreased dramatically, but it is still painfully high. At what point do we decide that the levels are acceptable? We accept a lot of risk when we live our lives on a daily basis, from the flu, from car accidents, from a number of different variables. At what point do we accept some of the trade-offs? So then he goes back and talks about how steep the curve was to begin with. Of course, remember, that's when there were no social distancing, no masks, no precautions of any kind. So we do have some mitigation to the same situation again. I understand there's risk of a second wave, but at what point do we accept a little bit of risk? So he goes on to say that Finger Lakes and Southern Tier Mohawk Valley are ready to enter phase 1 of the state's reopening plan. Central and northern New York really have been significantly less affected by the whole situation, so it looks like he's going to start opening those sections of the state. He then goes on to say here, when someone asks, well, why did we go through all this pain for 2 to 3 months? Because we saved lives, that's why. Just a little bit dramatic, but I guess I understand the sentiment. Moving on to Eric Rosengren. He says if the U.S. cannot resolve its public health issues, there's a limit to what the Fed can do to help. Now, this title is a little bit deceptive because it says here the Fed has a lot of tools to do a lot of things, but it can't solve public health problems. So really what he's saying here is not that the Fed is willing to do all of the things that it needs to do to support the economy, but he's saying that the Fed itself cannot solve the public health problem. And in that, he's essentially saying we have to solve the public health problem, or what the Fed does is not necessarily going to be able to prop up the markets. He says here, if we don't get the public health right, there's a limit to how much we're going to be able to do to solve that problem. He then goes on to talk about a lot of things related to the virus. So similarly to what the Fed chair said, if people cannot go out to restaurants and shopping centers and on airlines comfortably, then the amount of people that go to those places is going to be reduced. You can't simply print money and force people out of their homes to buy things. So they need to feel comfortable going to those places and buying things. Otherwise, we're going to be limited to online retailers that can figure out how to ship things without causing community spread within their shipping centers. And essentially, he's saying the Fed can't impact those health concerns. He continues to say a lot of the things that the Fed chair said in his 60 Minutes interview. He said that the recovery coming out of the pandemic will be impacted by high debt levels needed to pay for reliefs. He also said he supports these debt levels, but at some point they're going to have to be paid down. So if you know anything about credit cycles and debt cycles, when there's heavy debt loads, the economy tends to contract in order to pay down those debts. And depending how it's managed, sometimes there can be inflation during those periods. That's not really on people's minds quite yet because we are currently in a deflationary period because people are hoarding their money right now because there is so much uncertainty. But once this thing opens up and people go out and start spending, there is a potential for inflation. And if there's high debt levels, then the government might need to inflate the currency in order to pay down its debts. Just to explain debt cycles a little bit further, this is a chart from Ray Dalio. The purple line is the short-term debt cycles, and the blue line is the productive growth, and then the green line is the long-term debt cycle. So the purple line is every 7 to 10 years, and that's why we see market dips on average every 7 to 10 years. And that's the economy going into a retraction in order to pay its debts. And in 2008, we saw the long-term debt cycle dip down, which is why we had that large drop, along with a number of other reasons. But it happened to coincide with the long-term debt cycle. And since then, we've seen a bull run, and hopefully we won't see another long-term debt cycle until the end of the century. All right, on to the doom and gloom article. Today, in scary numbers, the pandemic could cost $82 trillion. Got a picture of some Russians cleaning each other off in St. Petersburg. It goes on to say that the impact to the economy will be $82 trillion. And that study is brought by the Cambridge University Business School. It says here it does need to be put into context. That is over the course of 5 years, not just 1 year. It explains that the GDP for the 19 leading countries in the world was $69.2 trillion. And optimistic estimates project a decline of 5.3% over the next 5 years. It says, optimistically, we expect to lose $3.3 trillion over the next 5 years. It says the consensus expectation calls for $2.68 trillion, or a 5.3% decline in GDP. Then it says in terms of 5-year factor, looks like $550 billion to $19.9 trillion lost in just the United States. So that's a pretty wide range, from $550 billion up to $19.9 trillion. Does sound kind of like a headline, something that's not super supported by data, if you can just throw out an extremely wide range like that. So we could lose as little as $550 billion over 5 years, which is still a pretty big number, but not really compared to $19.9 trillion. That's almost one entire year of GDP. That seems like a pretty high projection. GDP for the United States is somewhere in the vicinity of $20 trillion per year. Just for reference, the federal government received $3.5 trillion in taxes last year. The article goes on to say that the markets are not in step with the economy. Shows here that the S&P 500 is up 30% from its March lows, which is about 10% short of its highs in February. To help support the theory, it does say that the global economy could be depressed for up to 40 years after the pandemic has passed. Again, this seems pretty outlandish. I just don't see that being the case. The Federal Reserve is propping up a lot of these businesses. I think we're a little bit slow to open right now, but once we get open, I think we're going to be fine. I think the amount of COVID cases have not been accurately depicted. I think more people have gotten this than have been tested, which means the survival rate is going to be significantly higher than we think it is. And once those numbers have been shown to be true, that this economy is going to open up, I still think we're going to have reduced growth. That's in reference to the Nike swoosh that Jerome Powell was talking about. Not quite the V-shaped recovery we had hoped for, but at least it is a recovery. Then goes on to compare this to other plagues. We're right now on par with the Italian plague in terms of reference, Nowhere near the Spanish flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu. We did have a global flu pandemic. Looks like 1890 that killed about 1 million people. Russian cholera killed 1 million people. So right now for this virus, we're at 297,000. This number is a little bit old. I think we're up to like 320,000 globally, but it's definitely not on par with some of these other flus that we've experienced in relatively recent history. It says here, Paul Hollingsworth, head of the UK economics at BNP Paribas, said that he thinks this is going to shift global economics, which is going to include households saving more cash and allowing them to protect themselves a little bit more, a realignment of supply chains, which we're already seeing. Some companies are moving their supply chains out of China, which I do think is healthy. I think we need to have a little bit more secure supply chains, and those supply chains should at least be with countries that are a little more friendly to the United States. It also mentions higher digitalization, which I think was already the case. This just accelerated our movement towards that. Some people were already working from home before this, and they will just continue to work from home, or more people will work from home in the future. All right, to summarize, Governor Cuomo says his state has flattened the curve and is starting to reopen in northern and central New York. Eric Rosengren said the Fed cannot affect the health situation in the United States. Again, some revolutionary information from the Fed. And a Cambridge University study said that this pandemic could cost $82 trillion over the course of the next 5 years. It didn't mention this in the article, but the effects of losing that kind of GDP over the next 5 years really has a huge impact on things like poverty and hunger around the world. We're not really seeing that in first world countries right now, but the after effects of this situation are going to be felt for years in developing countries. Speaking of developing countries, that brings me to today's jelly. A man built a swimming pool with his bare hands in 60 days. Pretty impressive work ethic. Definitely a very difficult task, and you don't really see him eat a lot or rest a lot. I guess they wouldn't show that in the video, but I can't imagine he had a lot of resources. This jelly is a little bit longer, so I'm going to be speeding up through some portions and putting some commentary over others. Anyway, it's very impressive. Here's what that looks like. This dude is using a basket as like a handheld shovel. And throughout the video, they don't show enough of how much dirt this guy has to move throughout this whole video to make this thing. It's really ridiculous, the sheer volume of dirt he's going to have to move. It took me till around this point to realize that this dude's hands must be as hard as rocks. Like, if you've ever done any work with a shovel or anything like that, it really chews up your hands if you're not used to it. And this dude is going for days with that thing that doesn't even really have a handle. Again, this guy going hard with that basket shovel thing, moving ridiculous amounts of dirt. Finally, just now getting to the pool part. This whole thing really reminds me of like an Egyptian themed temple. At this point, he's got all of the framework done, and now he's just taking some time to make it look good. He's got to cut down all those bamboo stalks to make his bed. Comfy. That other bed was so comfy, he decided to make another. Also comfy. It looks like he's taking this termite mound and he's going to use it to make some kind of liner for his pool. It must turn into something like concrete. Apparently, he feels like he's got time and energy to paint it. Got to make sure it looks good when it's all done. He's got those red and green Christmas colors going on. I like it. Got to have some grass around your pool to make sure your feet feel real nice when you're walking around. This dude is a straight machine moving that water. Got a little leech there. This dude spots a fish and catches it with his bare hands like a savage. He's got to make sure that he cooks the fish so that he can eat it. What a lovely candlelight dinner he's got. You saw that right. He filled that pool for 7 days. And finally, he gets to take a swim in his pool and enjoy all of the hard work. I'm sure that it was worth it. That dude is a straight savage. Absolutely ridiculous amounts of labor to make that thing look amazing. And with that, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.